Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to our newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com.
Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Natalie Foster, author of a new book called The Guarantee. The book is a call to action for why and how the government should provide a basic floor to its citizens for shelter, education, healthcare, and an inheritance. I'm generally sympathetic with the thinking that citizens should benefit from the abundance that technology has created for society in our lifetime, as long as it doesn't create additional bureaucracy and complexity for its administration. And talking about complexity, many of us ordinary people are ignorant about the incredible complexity of the world that we're born into and don't have the social capital required to navigate it. As someone remarked, complexity is a subsidy for the wealthy and the powerful who have the means to understand and exploit it, while ordinary people struggle to navigate it. The Guarantee is a call to action to level the playing field a little. Natalie, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Before we get started, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your journey been till this point?
Yeah, I'm based out of Oakland, president of the Economic Security Project. And, I was a daughter of a preacher from Kansas and discovered organizing in college, and organizing comes naturally to preachers' kids. You're trained to bring people together for shared purpose. You can believe in a better world, and so I've never really looked back. And I have probably 2 decades plus under my belt of social change work. I've used technology to bring people together, early in the digital space, which was about 10 years behind the private sector. When it came to politics and social change. So this is, I think the early aughts, the mid-aughts, was when a really profound period of technological, of using technology to bring people together, and have really organized around ideas the last part of my work. I didn't want to just protest the results of bad economic policy. I wanted to set the table for good economic policy. And so that's what I've been focused on.
Being a preacher's daughter reminds me of Pulp Fiction for some reason. Is that a private joke between you and your husband?
Yeah, I often hear other dirty dancing. But no, the son of a preacher man. That's right.
Yeah. So, Natalie, your book, The Guarantee, very interesting. You're not holding back at all here. You're going for the sort of several of Maslow's basic needs here. So tell us the basic sort of thesis of the book.
Yeah. The thesis is that we deserve an economy in America that supports human flourishing, regardless of race, religion, and zip code. And I'm arguing for that guarantee economy because, unlike the scarcity-obsessed thinking that's really marked the last 50 years of economic policymaking, the guarantee economy would guarantee an economic floor that allows everyone to build their lives of dignity and agency and presence, the ability to be present with people you love, with your community, and that all of that is not possible if we are living hand to mouth, if we are left as brittle as we are today in a world where 25% of Americans have nothing saved for retirement, and 4 out of 10 families could not pull together $400 in an emergency if they needed to. That is an economy that is really frankly, at the brink of democracy. And so I'm interested in that floor and I think government has an important role to play in that floor. So that's the guarantee in a nutshell.
So Natalie, America is supposed to be about, opportunity, possibility, right? I mean, that's what sort of, drives people to come here and make a better life for themselves. What's wrong with the existing model? Or I guess another way of asking is, where have things gone wrong? Have things gone off the rails? I mean, or has it always been skewed and, is opportunity and flourishing a myth?
No, I don't believe opportunity and flourishing is a myth. There was a time in American history when we understood government's role in the economy very differently. And we invested in and built the American middle class. And my family benefited from that period. My grandfather fought in wars and went to school on the GI Bill. There were all kinds of loan programs to start the small business that he'd start in his small Oklahoma town. And that is the type of policy that we should have again in this country, but updated for the multiracial 21st century context in which we live. And so you're asking what went wrong. And, I would argue it's been since really the election of Ronald Reagan. For the past 45, 50 years, we've been told a very specific story. You can call it trickle-down economics. You can call it neoliberalism. But the story is that government has no role, so zero faith in government, total faith in the market to solve our problems, and that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And that ideology pervaded both sides of the aisle and was unassailable, like the weather. It was like the weather. There's nothing we can do about it. That's just how American capitalism is. And I think there's periods I even believed that. And it also believed the part of the bootstraps, myth. And so have been really interested in what is a new story that says government has a very important role in ensuring a floor, not the ceiling, but a floor for everyone, regardless of race, religion, or zip code. And it's no longer pie in the sky that we're starting to see this being built.
So why is Reagan considered, such a hero in this? People refer to him in glowing terms. And I must say that I came to America, during Jimmy Carter's time. So I saw Reagan win the election, which I found really depressing personally, because I viewed the Reagan administration as incredibly corrupt. There were all kinds of scandals, the Iran-Contra scandal. I could go on. But why is Reagan regarded as such a hero? Is it because the wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed? Or am I wrong? Or do people view Reagan differently? Or am I just imagining that he's, lionized and viewed as this great American president?
I think it really depends on what circles you're running in, because, I certainly view him as the beginning of total divestment from supporting everyday people. There was a period of time, a lot of these ideas were laid, the groundwork was laid across academic institutions, across journalism, across the courts of, let's move government out of the way. Let's let the market solve the problems, and let's tell everyone a story that there's no public goods. No, that it's personal responsibility to make it in this economy. And it would be the election of Thatcher and Reagan that ushered those ideas into policy so firmly. And so, I imagine he's considered a hero in some circles because he's swashbuckling. But look, I live in California and he was governor here, and it would be Governor Reagan who would preside over, talk about the guarantee of higher education, right? Which we'll get into, I'm sure, at some point. One of the guarantees I track in the book. And the higher ed was really considered a public good in California. It was very, very inexpensive to go to the public schools in the state, the excellent University of California's school system. And it would be Reagan who would fire the architect of higher education as a public good and usher in the sense that it's a personal investment, or one must take out hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to afford higher education. And it would be California who would, kick that off. So I think it's not just about a man. And, we'll talk about some of the trends reversing today. It's not just about Joe Biden. It's about the culture and the groundwork that was laid and the political winds that were blowing during that period of time that the politicians are responsive to.
Yeah, Natalie, one of the things that I guess resonates with most Americans is this notion of personal responsibility, right? That, you're responsible for yourself. There's no handouts, there's no guarantees. You got to work hard and you'll make it, right? And that sort of resonates with people. What's wrong with that?
It does resonate with people. And I want that world to be true. Guarantees exist in American capitalism today. Businesses, corporations get guarantees, the guarantee of the court system, the guarantee of patents, guarantee of shareholder liability. So you are not held personally responsible for any corporate activity that you are on the board of. The guarantees exist for business today. I'm arguing we should extend those guarantees to everyday people who make this economy run from the ground up. And on top of that floor, people then can absolutely live the lives of freedom, of dignity, of presence that they deserve to live, but right now aren't, because our people are working hand to mouth, living hand to mouth, working 3 jobs to put food on the table here in the richest nation on earth, in the richest moment in history. And so I see this as a really important evolution of capitalism, right? It's what venture capitalist Roy Bahat calls trampoline capitalism, that it's not a net that holds people. It's a trampoline, right? They touch down and then they're allowed to jump back up when there's a bit of economic security to support that risk-taking and entrepreneurialism and ingenuity.
Natalie, the kinds of things you're talking about, like, let's say, patent protection and, various other things, are those guarantees or are they sort of solid institutions? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I'm reminded of, this book called The Narrow Corridor, which I mentioned in passing offline, by Acemoglu and Robinson. And, one of the things they say is that healthy democracies have a balance of power between the state and the people, and the responsibility of the state is to provide
trusted institutions
that function, that are transparent, they're fair. So are those guarantees or are they institutions? Although I will, I think your larger point is well taken in that there are all kinds of other guarantees that, exist, even in free markets, and there's regulation and stuff like that. But coming back to that, are those guarantees or are they sort of institutions that, Western Europe and the U.S., as they say, sort of managed to, put into place, sometimes almost by accident, that have led to sort of a flourishing of, liberal democracy and markets?
Although, I must add, trust in the U.S. government seems to be at an all-time low relative to the last 50 years.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think there are guarantees backed by institutions. The Federal Reserve is an institution to back our monetary system, to make sure that the guarantee of a stable currency is there. And I want that for everyone. I'd love to talk about the narrow corridor a bit. I find that concept really important, that there is a corridor between the state and the people, right? And that where the state doesn't have too far, is not creeping into authoritarianism, and people have freedom and dignity. And there's this narrow corridor. And I actually think that is what the guarantees are, that we have moved so far in this country in believing that government has no role in ensuring a floor, that we need to bring it back to that narrow corridor in the middle to say, yes, there is a floor. Right now today, I think we have guarantees of homelessness, for example. We have said housing is a commodity left entirely up to the market for the last 50 years, and government has no role in creating a floor of housing in this country. And that decision guarantees us people on the streets, which we are seeing exploding in cities like mine, in Oakland, and probably around you in New York. And so let's flip that on its head. And that to me seems like the space where the state can ensure security and people can flourish. Because I'm not talking about the ceiling. The ceiling's a different thing. How high people can go, how far they go, what all they want to have and build in their lives, that is all possible. I'm talking about the floor. And that's just not a conversation we've had for a long time.
It's interesting. Just a couple of hours ago, I was in my doctor's office, and I told him, I said, I'm recording a podcast at 2:30. And he said, oh, who's it with? And I said, oh, it's with Natalie Foster. She's written this book called The Guarantee. And he said, oh, yeah, like what's it about? I said, she is arguing for the government guaranteeing, education, housing, healthcare. And he said, have you read about this project in Houston? And I was like, no. He said, apparently homelessness was a big problem in Houston. And city basically, took over some buildings and, provided people a place to go to.
That has to be so destabilizing, to not have a safe place to go to. I mean, it's a basic human need. In fact, a basic animal need, as the director of my octopus teacher, Pippa Ehrlich, mentioned in the previous podcast. Animals have homes too, but I guess I digress. So are you familiar with the Houston success story? I almost say Houston, being a New Yorker. It's an interesting data point for your thesis.
I mean, I've read headlines on that, and I think that is that's where this, the city started building a bunch of housing. And one of the things I track in the book is Project Room Key, where the government during the pandemic not only gave people assistance to pay their rents, pay their mortgage, and keep them in their homes, which, by the way, is far more cost efficient than when people become unhoused, which gets far more expensive. They also, passed an eviction moratorium that kept people, renters, safe in their homes, but also did things like buy hotels and move the unhoused in, giving people a key to a room of their own during a period of time when we were very concerned that shelters and sleeping on the streets was going to spread, COVID even further. And so it was just like the man on the moon style thinking applied to housing. That's what I see, happening in Houston. And that is exactly what I'm talking about is possible here if we decide it is our job to guarantee housing in this country. While we're on housing, just to give one more anecdote of hope here. For a long time, people looked at Vienna, where 82% of people in Vienna live in housing that is kept off the speculative market, and rents are stable, therefore, and it's all maintained and run by governments or nonprofits, and it's beautiful. It's like pools, community spaces, dense urban housing. And now that is being built in places like Montgomery County, Maryland. We have the housing authority there building housing for middle income Marylanders, kept permanently off the speculative market, right on a transit line outside of DC, breaking ground on a carbon neutral building, and understanding that government has a role in creating more housing production in this country alongside the market, not replacing it, but adding to the supply side production in this country. And I just think that is a sign of hope.
What kind of pushback do you get to your proposal, typically?
Well, I'd love to hear what pushback you think I might get, given your perch at Stern and other places. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But one thing I hear a lot of is, isn't this just socialism? And, you heard me argue earlier, I think this is an evolution of capitalism. I think this is trampoline capitalism. And there's a time in American history where we had policy that looked more like the guarantees. So it's even uniquely American. That's another thing I hear is like, you'll point to Scandinavian countries or European countries. We can't do that. That's not possible here in America, which is why in the book, I tried to root all my examples of where this is happening right here in the United States with very few exceptions so that, we could sort of remind ourselves that it is possible here.
Well, since you threw the question back at me, I guess what I would say is that the main criticism people would have, one, you've already sort of stated, isn't this socialism? And, America is not about socialism, but but perhaps a more sort of substantive counter would be that, government institutions tend to get corrupt. They tend to be inept. The incentives are warped in that once they come into existence, their only objective is to perpetuate themselves, right? And those are, in my mind, sort of legitimate concerns in sort of creating new agencies, with the best of intentions, right? That, intentions are good, but somewhere along the way, there's a sort of disconnect between sort of concept and execution, that government tends to be sort of poor at executing. Now, but I'll stop there. There's a couple of other things that I want to sort of come back to from the narrow corridor, because I think you're right historically that America historically has had very significant, private-public partnerships. The railroad system, the postal service, were key, public-private partnerships and very creatively done. But those are the kinds of, coming back to sort of the pushbacks, is just, large government. They tend to be inept, that, poor execution, right? And those are, in my mind, sort of some legitimate concerns around giving government sort of more of a role in people's lives, especially when it comes to basic things like housing, education, healthcare.
Take the well-intentioned Department of Education, for example, and its recent botched release of the free application for federal student aid form called FAFSA. Its delays and calculation errors derailed a lot of college applicants. It's just a lot more complicated than we expect, right, when the government gets involved in administering programs.
I think it's really important that government works in people's lives. We're talking right now in the midst of this FAFSA situation where FAFSA forms that young people who enter college have to fill out in order to get their financial assistance, how much they qualify for, et cetera, has just not worked. And that has left a lot of people without clarity and assistance heading into college this fall, which is a real disaster. Like, it's a real problem when government doesn't work in people's lives. There's a lot of reasons for it. I highly recommend Jennifer Palka's new book, Recoding America. She founded Code for America, and she digs deep into what are the procedures that have been in place that allows government from working. So it's very important we figure that piece out. It's also not a surprise to me because we've told a story for so long and we've emboldened elected officials for so long who want to literally drown government in the bathtub. That's been the stated goal. So it also makes sense that, it won't work. Let me give an example that's being debated right now in Congress. I got off the phone this morning with Rosa DeLauro, a congresswoman from Connecticut. And the IRS, right? the IRS is the institution that is supposed to make sure people pay their taxes, including the wealthy, to pay their taxes. And so it's really important that we fund that agency so that it can do its job. And there is like a big debate right now about knocking, billions of dollars off of IRS funding that some right of center factions have moved forward. That would mean that, this agency can't do its job, which is really important to funding all the things that we care about. So we have to also, fund government to be able to work. But let me end on also a note of where government's working, since I started on one where it doesn't, with FAFSA. This year, the IRS rolled out Direct File, which is a public option for tax filing. Okay, so right now, if you are low income and you have standardized taxes and, your employer pays their payroll taxes, the government knows exactly how much you've made. And yet we require taxpayers to go pay H&R Block and Intuit and other tax prep companies to be able to file their own taxes if the government knows exactly how much, they're going to be filing. So this year, the IRS rolled out Direct File in 13 states. They tested it and it worked beautifully. It's a free tax filing system that if you have simple taxes, you go on, it literally pre-populates how much your taxes were last year. You click a button. This is what other countries have. The stories of, getting a postcard in the mail and saying, is this your tax burden this year? Click here, in other countries has always been so inspiring to me. And now it's happening in the US, and we don't hear about it because it didn't blow up. There wasn't some big drama around it like there was, healthcare.gov 14 years ago when we passed the ACA. So I think there's also a way in which when government works in people's lives, it works beautifully and we take it for granted. And then when it doesn't, it's a real problem.
You asked me about my opinion on sort of the pushback stuff, but I also think that, maybe the savior here might be technology, right? I mean, and the example you're pointing to is an example where technology made things easier.
Direct File is a great example of that case, so you don't create additional bureaucracy, or rather eliminate it by designing better processes thanks to the technology.
Well, one thing on that I just want to say is I think there's been a way that technology has been used to cut people from the rolls, to find, places where there's been an inconsistency and purge. And what if, I'm very interested in the government, public entrepreneurs who are looking to use technology, AI, to add, to create, to support, to build out. And I just couldn't agree with you more. And I think organizations like Code for America and what Tara McGinnis is doing at New America, looking at, public officials, public servants essentially, who are also technologists, and figuring out how to embed that into our systems to support people and build out this floor. I think that is very promising.
Yeah. I mean, your points on, housing, totally resonate, with me. And like I was saying, I can't imagine what it's like to not come back to a place. And the Houston experiment was interesting because, they gave people a room. I mean, these aren't like complexes with pools and all kinds of amenities, but just something basic, just a place to go back to. But let's come to education, right? Because, and you mentioned the FAFSA fiasco, in the Department of Education. And, one of my previous guests, Caitlin Zaloom, who's written this book called Indebted, talks about how people sort of get trapped into a cycle of debt through education, from having to pay for education. In fact, the system is run by a lot of private agencies, and there's all kinds, who are there to make money, and there's all kinds of fees and, costs that sort of get, added to the system. And so I want to sort of come back to sort of this, because I asked you what kind of pushback do you get to, your proposal. And, as far as education is concerned, it seems like one of those things where good intentions, but a lot of the execution is done by the private sector with a profit motive, and something just sort of doesn't work there. Things sort of break down. How do you think about that?
Yeah, Indebted's been a book I want to read, so I'm glad you're bringing that up. I think two things I would just add to her analysis is, one, just there is an over-reliance on contractors, often because of the underfunding of many agencies. And so that has, I think, left us more brittle when you're contracting everything out at a high rate. And then I, again, just have to invoke Jen Pelka's book here, because she talks at length about the procurement processes and how we just have to reform them in order to truly unleash the ability to, to do things like user testing. And that's just going to be very important to building out the guarantee economy, is that government can center communities as users and build using the way we know how to build in the private sector today. And I think it's possible. And I think it's already happening in many, many places. I also point to the work of Suzanne Mettler in my book, who coined the phrase, the submerged state, that so often government does very meaningful things, but doesn't tell anyone about it. And it's often for nefarious reasons, because we want to tell the story, of a very small government, but also for less nefarious reasons. That's just sort of the way things are done. She talks about loans that are subsidized by the government and guaranteed by the government, but are offered through private banks and private entities, right? So it doesn't feel like government working in your life. It feels like the bank. Or benefits that take the form of tax breaks or incentives that often are carried out by nonprofits. So it feels like the nonprofits working in your life, not the government. And so I don't think all of this is necessarily bad, but I think it's important to pull the veil away to see the full picture of what government does do in our lives that we may or may not see.
Do you get a pushback that this is sort of regressive? That, let's say, giving everyone free education is regressive because a lot of people don't need it, and so it just sort of imposes sort of this unnecessary cost on the system that has to be funded, right? Because a lot of people can afford college, they don't need a guarantee, so it's a regressive kind of system. Do you get that kind of pushback? I mean, that would be typically like a libertarian kind of a pushback, I guess, to the guarantee.
Well, what I appreciate about that pushback is centering, the communities who are most impacted and wanting to support those communities, But what I think is important here is that on college, for example, the guarantee would simply be through the public institutions. There would still be private institutions. People will still choose them. They can still cost how much they want. A lot of how I see the guarantee being created in the world is through public options, where government is creating a low-cost, high-quality option that competes in the market and creates the floor that's available. And I also think this gets to your question about how we ensure the entities don't just self-perpetuate in existence, is that they'd be, inside of markets competing. But on the regression, I think a lot of that has to do with how these things are paid for. If you offer universal programs and you pay for it through a more robust taxing of the wealthy and corporations who've done very well in America, that if we all paid our fair share, then I don't think it is regressive. If you tried to do something like this with our current tax system, then you'd be in a very different situation. And I'll just say next year is going to be very important, because in 2025, the Trump tax cuts expire. And that means there will be a showdown on taxes in America and what we owe one another as a society. And do we want to continue a world where the 39 biggest companies pay $0 in taxes and, have billions in profits? Or do we want to create a world where everybody pays their fair share and we can invest in a floor so that we don't have to experience, all of us, a world where, every night there's more and more people living out on the streets. There's more and more mental health problems due to the fact, your point about the anxiety people feel about not knowing where to sleep. I recently had an advocate talk about sleep deprivation and what that does to the human brain. We know what it's like when we don't get a good night's sleep. Imagine that night after night after night, honking, yelling. Like, that is not a world we have to live in, but we also have to have tax codes that support that. And, tax codes are moral documents. They show what we care about as a society.
There's an interesting book called Why We Sleep. I don't want to go off on that tangent. It's a really interesting one, like really deep analysis of sleep and its role.
Wait, just give me one little hint on why we sleep.
Oh, no, it's too long.
Oh, damn.
That's going to take this is going to take like 10 minutes, and we don't have that kind of time because you got to hop. But, you mentioned fair share a few times, right? And it's hard to argue against that, right? I guess where we run into problems is people just disagree on what that means. Like, what does it mean for people to pay their fair share?
Well, can't we agree that if you're one of the 39 biggest companies in America, your fair share is higher than $0?
Yes. So, which actually brings me to the next question, because I wanted to talk about in the role of technology and particularly AI now, coming into the picture, right, which is changing the landscape for employment, is likely to transform things in the next, decade or so. It seems to me that we're already sort of moving towards sort of to keep it simple, two-class structure where some people, you can't pay them enough. It's just impossible to get. The compensations are, eye-popping. And then there's a sort of another class of jobs where you can barely make ends meet, right? And the latter seems to be vastly outnumbering the former, right? And so I wonder whether there's a need for guarantees based on that alone, right? That this isn't sort of markets and any of that, but it's just like the impending impact of technology, right? And Andrew Yang talks about that, right? He was on the podcast a couple of years ago. And, Albert Wenger, I think feels similarly that, that you need, universal basic income because a lot of people are just going to get displaced and have a hard time finding employment, because, the machine will just displace them. And so that would argue for guarantees. How do you think about the role of AI and how that sort of plays into your theory?
I very much think that the trends we've seen over the last 50 years will continue, which is we've seen jobs be created that we couldn't have even imagined once existed. We've seen jobs go away, like the travel agent, that were staples of like American middle class life. And the jobs that we've created are not good jobs. They're often piecemeal. They're often informal. They don't come with benefits and protections that exist inside of the formal employment structure. Those are choices that we're making as a society, but it certainly means that as things shift, they do not necessarily shift in a way that supports the American worker. And in fact, history has shown they don't, right? There's like this famous graph that the Economic Policy Institute has made that I actually include in the book. And it's, the history of sort of productivity and growth, which has gone up for 50 years, and wages for the American worker, which has stayed stagnant for 50 years.
Right. In fact, for the Piketty's work there as well, right? The return on capital versus labor, right? If I remember correctly, right? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I appreciate it. And so I just think that a social floor is going to be a hugely important part to the social contract in the 21st century for exactly the reasons you lay out. And look, you've lived this, right? You've seen what machine learning does on Wall Street, like how it changes the jobs on Wall Street. And so I just think it's, you know, on one hand, we need to think clearly about the work and the structure of work and the decisions we make around that, because we do have agency there. And then on the other hand, we have to think about a floor, because the floor offers us resilience against the things that we cannot yet see, right? The chaos of this century, whether it be climate chaos, whether it be chaos in the labor market, like we're talking about, or even another pandemic. The way you weather that is through resiliency. And a social floor gives us economic resiliency, gives everyone economic resiliency.
I guess another way of looking at what I'm saying is that, you know, I asked this question to Paul Sheard, who's a macroeconomist. I said, you know, imagine a future where 1,000 companies with 1,000 employees satisfy the basic needs of humanity. You know, am I just like hallucinating, or is that actually possible? You know, and I somehow I feel that I can envision a future like that, right, where there's, you know, huge technological progress and, you know, basic needs are, you know, satisfied relatively easily. And so that's 1 million people. Right? So what do the rest of us do? Well, the rest of us reap the technological dividend, I guess, right? Which is where universal basic income comes in and the guarantee. So that's, I mean, to me, the compelling reason for guarantees and universal basic income is that I think that's sort of the way technology is forcing us, you know, that may be inevitable, right? That they're not going to be a ton of high-paying jobs, right? You know, because AI sort of eliminates them, right? It does stuff so much better than most people do, and it's going to continue to improve. You know, you're going to see massive efficiencies, you know, in production. And in the world like that, you don't need people grinding away, you know, cleaning machines or checking paperwork and making approvals, you know, and all that kind of stuff that people do for a living these days, right? All that stuff just goes away, right? It becomes meaningless because the machine does it. So what do people do?
Well, I think one thing people do is care. We will always need people who care for our children, who care for our aging parents, who care for the disabled. Care is something that will never be outsourced to machines. And in America, care is an example of the type of work that exists in the informal economy and does not come with the benefits and protections of white collar work, and is largely done by women of color, historically Black women in this country, and pays very little. And so it is like a great example of like, it's like a canary in the coal mine here. There will be work. It will not necessarily be good work unless we choose to make it so. And then even still, your point is that that is actually a world, the world you're articulating is a world our founding fathers thought would happen as they imagined automation moving forward in this country. It felt clear that we would have more leisure time on our hands. And, you know, Thomas Paine himself argued for both a guaranteed income, but also a lump sum payment for young people when they come of age. I talk about one of the guarantees as the inheritance guarantee. It's colloquially known as baby bonds. And it's this idea that there should be trusts established at birth for children that when they turn 21, they have essentially risk capital, seed capital to start their lives, right? To buy a home, to start a business, to get a degree. And that those are the kinds of ideas that would spread the gains of such a prosperous society around. so that everyone benefited, so that communities were healthier, families were healthier, and frankly, our democracy would be healthier. So yeah, I very much agree that technological advancement is one of the reasons to really invest in a social floor. I also know that very few things move forward based on future concerns in this country. We can barely handle like the threats that are right in front of us. And so often we just don't, we can't really move policy forward on the threats in front of us. So I also think it's important to root it in the here and the now while holding the future prognosis.
So you mentioned baby bonds. Is that something that's, has the train left the station here? Is that happening already? I read that it was close to happening in Connecticut. Or am I imagining that?
No, you're exactly right. It's like an idea, if we'd had this conversation 10 years ago, it would have simply just been some white papers by Professor Derek Hamilton at the New School, Sandy Darity in North Carolina. They've done a lot of the scholarship, the modern scholarship on this idea and how baby bonds can start to alleviate the racial wealth gap in America, the deeply immoral racial wealth gap that white families have 8 times the wealth of Black families in America. And so it was an idea. There were papers, there was research, and politicians started looking into it. And sure enough, Cory Booker would run for president on this idea in 2020. And in 2021, the state of Connecticut would be the first to pass baby bonds. And we've seen a number of places follow suit. Washington, D.C., my home state of California, Senator Nancy Skinner passed a baby bonds program forward, and a number of states. I just testified in Vermont to a subcommittee hearing that's looking at establishing baby bonds in the state of Vermont. So this is the laboratories of democracy, right? This is the states and the cities working out these policies so that the next moment of a crisis, right? This is Milton Friedman words himself, who said, "It is only in a crisis, real or perceived, when ideas that are lying around are picked up and they're moved forward." And that is what I believe, that's what we saw in the pandemic. And that's what I hope happens again as these ideas move forward at the local level.
Natalie, I really like your thinking that, quote unquote, a floor offers resilience against things we can't see yet. So why not just have a universal basic income and be done with it, where you give everyone a certain amount of money guaranteed and they use it as they see fit. No complex administration is needed, no FAFSA, SHAFSA forms, no nothing but a basic guarantee in the form of cash.
Yeah, well, that is exactly the place I started in 2016. I started my organization, Economic Security Project, with Dorian Warren, who's president of Community Change, and Chris Hughes, who's a Facebook co-founder. And the three of us were very interested in this idea of giving people money. At that time, there was not much of a robust conversation in the U.S. at all. There was something in Europe growing. Switzerland would have a ballot measure shortly thereafter. So we were really interested in that. And, as people who work in social change and politics, we also knew it was a long way off from the mainstream, right? It was an idea, an interesting idea, but ideas don't put food on the table for people, And so how do you move something like that forward? And so we launched Economic Security Project. We commissioned a bunch of research, and we knew that this needed to live and breathe in the world. And so we're looking for a city to demonstrate this idea. And I sat next to Mayor Michael Tubbs at a conference, and he had been one of the youngest mayors in American history to take office in Stockton, California. And he said, I read Dr. King's last book. And in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last book, he calls for a guaranteed minimum income to abolish poverty, right? This is during the war on poverty. Let's end poverty once and for all. And I want to bring that back, and I want to demonstrate what's possible in America. So we at Economic Security Project would support him in doing that. Around the time there was a demonstration getting off the ground in Jackson, Mississippi with Dr. Aisha Yandaro, who started the Magnolia Mothers Trust. And she would give $1,000 a month to Black women living in public housing in Jackson. Mayor Michael Tubbs would give $500 a month to 125 families in Stockton, California. They would both open source their playbook. They would invite others in, and it would start being replicated. Then Andrew Yang would run for president on a UBI. But these replications were growing across the country, and mayors were signing on. 10 cities, 40 cities, 100 cities. 150 pilots now exist around this country in 35 states, and about 50,000 people have been engaged or participants are receiving checks every month. And all of it is it's sort of the R&D for the policy that will ultimately scale this idea to the nation. And it's just been such a great ride to see that move into the mainstream. And what I'll say is that cash is incredibly important. It gives people the ability to make decisions in their lives. It gives people the ability to quit a job that doesn't work. Now they'll have to find another job, but they have just a bit of money to say, you know what, I'm not gonna work for $7.25 an hour. I'm gonna go find something at $9 an hour, $10 an hour, $15 an hour, right? And it's not enough, right? The costs of healthcare, of housing, and higher education have skyrocketed beyond anyone's wildest dreams in this country. And so we have to, that's really why I wrote The Guarantee, because, you know, I've been working on cash, and I think it's a very important part of the social contract. But there are additionally other important parts that we're equally moving forward at a very fast clip that we saw glimmers of during the pandemic, where government would say, I have a role in making sure people are housed and making sure people have vaccines in their arms for free. I'm going to mobilize the National Guard to put free vaccines in people's arms. Like, that was unimaginable when I was a young pup growing up in Kansas. And yet here we are. So all that to say, I hear you on simplicity. And I think that should indeed be a goal. And I think it is one of the most beautiful parts of guaranteed income, is that people are the arbiters of their own financial lives, and it is simple. And I think we can apply that principle to other guarantees.
Natalie, I want to address a basic premise in your book you mentioned at the outset, that it's an overemphasis on free markets and, you know, neoclassical thinking and policy that have created more inequality. I'd argue that an even more important driver is technology, which has been creating, you know, these sort of winner-take-all outcomes, and that we'll see even more of this going forward, right? And the way I see it is brains will become more valuable than brawn in every industry thanks to AI. And, you know, what I really mean by that is that, you know, previously companies dominated their industry by brawn, you know, better, stronger physical products or services, whereas AI is creating a set of new leaders like NVIDIA, Microsoft, and Google, who are creating and supplying the brains of every industry, which I see, you know, as sort of where the future value lies. And that's probably why they're worth trillions already. So, you know, as someone who's immersed in the space of policy, how should lawmakers be thinking about this impending scenario that I'm painting, that is about, you know, policy that redistributes the massive tech dividend that seems to be becoming concentrated in the hands of very few winners who, as you know, you argue, aren't paying their fair share?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is today, as we talk, the Department of Justice and the FTC announced they are going to open antitrust and anti-monopoly probes into NVIDIA and the leaders of the AI revolution, because we know that the market concentration up and down the AI stack is significant. And we also know that market concentration leads to the lack of competition, to the inability for startups to exist, for, you know, anyone to enter this space. and it leads to a brittly economic society where, inequality gets worse. And so just like just like you brought up the railroads earlier, we knew it was important for private companies to lay the railroads, but there had to be rules. We had to say the railroads have to fit together. You have to allow competitors to run on your rails. And in fact, we're not going to let the same people own the rails who also run the cars on the rails, because that wouldn't make for competitive markets. And that's what we did. And so it's a era of trust busting and belief in competitive markets, and government's role in creating those rules and then enforcing those rules, that I think we have to have a competitive, dynamic, spirited technological markets in the future. And
great point. And since you brought the railroads, but we also gave the builders of those railroads incentives, right? They were given land that abutted the railroad, which would rise in value as the tracks got laid, and so they would benefit off of that. What's the equivalent here? I mean, I hear you about sort of the concentration, leading to excessive market power that could, stifle innovation. But what's the equivalent of sort of giving those railroads land abutting the railroad that would rise in value? Is there an equivalent that you can think of in the tech space? Incentives for, people who are sort of laying these, digital tracks, in this new economy?
I think you pointed it out yourself. Trillions of dollars of profits that these companies are currently making and poised to make as we enter the AI revolution. There's no shortage of money to be made in this space. And I want it to be made, and I want it to be also supporting the next generation of technological progress that will build on these shoulders. And it's hard to do if the cloud is owned entirely, by a handful of companies, or if the chips manufacturing is done entirely by a handful of companies. It's not good for competition, and frankly, it's not good for national security. So I think there's a lot of reasons to look at that. But so that's sort of along the what are the rules of the game and how do we enforce it? That's one piece that I think is important. The other question was, how do we get people to pay their fair share in taxes, right? How do we get companies to understand it is a privilege to pay into a functioning United States of America and to keep it going? That it should be a privilege to do so and not something to avoid. And, the truth is that it's all about what the rules are. It's not about individual actors doing the right thing. It should be about the tax code, right? Power is ensconced in policy. And so the tax code needs to reflect, this is the rules of doing business in America. And right now, it is not reflecting a world in which, everyday people are supported from a booming economy. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, well said. I think that the least we can do in this time of plenty, and others will argue we've gone from sort of an era of scarcity to an era of abundance in many ways. We should use that productively. So, well said. Any last minute thoughts, Natalie, before we wrap up? I'm just curious about what sort of the top of mind or top of agenda things are at the moment for the Economic Security Project, in addition to some of the things you've mentioned.
Well, we are very excited to hear that the direct file tax filing public option for free and fair tax filing is going to be made permanent and be rolled out across the country. So we're working closely with the IRS and others as state officials to make that happen. So we're excited about that. Next week, we're gathering about 400 guaranteed income advocates in Detroit, Michigan for the gathering that happens every 2 years called Guaranteed Income Now. We're really looking forward to conversation, because one of the things that's happening with guaranteed income is that states are starting to pass bills that ban the guaranteed income pilots happening at the city level. They're preemption bills. So the state of Iowa, state of Arkansas are banning Des Moines, and Little Rock from running these pilots. And that is a real erosion of freedom for these cities and a big challenge. And, the old adage is sort of, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you. And so that's where we are on the guarantee of income. But the final part is that you win, right? And that's ultimately where I believe this is heading. And the last thing I'll say is I just think this election in the fall couldn't be more important. It is a contest for the future, and it needs to be run as a contest for the future. What is the vision these candidates have for the American economy? One that can unleash the abundance you just mentioned for everyone across race, religion, or zip code in this country, or one that narrows it and takes us back. And so I just think it's incredibly important.
Good stuff. I look forward to seeing how this all rolls out. Well, I enjoyed reading your book, Natalie, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure we'll follow this up with equally interesting conversation. So thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it and enjoyed, both the book and the conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it as well. I'm loving this from brawn to brains framing that you have for the big shifts in society, and just really appreciate all that you brought in your incisive questions. So thank you.
Thanks so much.